I never imagined the most satisfying sound of my life would be handcuffs clicking shut around my own son's wrists. But to reach that moment, I first had to die a little inside. My name is Walter Sterling. I'm 68 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades calculating load-bearing capacities and stress points in Chicago's skyline. I helped build towers that stand against 100-mile-per-hour winds, but I couldn't build character into my son, Kevin. Christmas Eve, snow falling heavy on Interstate 90. My son and daughter-in-law Brenda pulled up to St. Jude's shelter on the south side and told me to get out. The excuse was technical, almost believable to someone who didn't know better. They claimed our furnace in Oak Park had failed, leaking deadly carbon monoxide through the vents. Kevin pulled my suitcase from the trunk without meeting my eyes, insisting it was for my safety. They'd pick me up in the morning, they promised. But standing on that frozen sidewalk, something didn't add up. I called my neighbor Jerry from the shelter's payphone. The truth hit like a sledgehammer. No gas leak. My house was lit up like a carnival. Luxury cars lining the driveway. They'd thrown me out to host an exclusive party for Brenda's wealthy family. I was just the embarrassing old man who didn't fit their aesthetic. I spent that night on a cot, surrounded by the smell of bleach and broken dreams, and in my coat pocket, I found a lottery ticket I'd bought earlier that day with loose change. $10 million, every single number matched. Stick around. You need to hear how an abandoned old man became the nightmare his family never saw coming. The morning after Christmas, I didn't rush to claim my prize. 40 years as an engineer taught me something crucial. Never apply force to a structure before you understand where it's weakest. I sat in that shelter cafeteria, drinking watered-down coffee, while men half my age complained about their luck. Mine had just changed, but I kept my mouth shut. First rule of any inspection: observe before you act. Around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. Kevin. He sounded cheerful, asking if I'd slept well, saying they'd swing by to pick me up around noon. No apology, no explanation, just casual dismissal of the fact they'd dumped their father at a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve. I told him I'd be ready. Then I called Frank Miller, a divorce attorney I'd known for 30 years from our Thursday poker games. Frank specialized in ugly separations where one spouse tried to hide assets. He knew every trick in the book and had connections with every judge in Cook County. When I told him what Kevin had done and what I'd won, Frank went quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, that sharp bark of a laugh he reserves for when someone's about to get destroyed in court. He told me not to claim the ticket yet, not to tell anyone, not to go home. Instead, he made 3 calls while I waited. First, to a financial crimes investigator he'd worked with. Second, to a probate attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Third, to a reporter at Channel 7 News who owed him a favor. The plan crystallized like ice, forming on a window. By noon, I wasn't at the shelter anymore. Frank had checked me into a modest hotel near O'Hare, paying cash. Kevin called 6 times. I didn't answer. Let him wonder. Let him worry that his senile old father had wandered off in confusion. That evening, I sat in that hotel room and did what I should have done years ago. I reviewed my finances with clear eyes. My pension was solid. Social Security covered basics, but I'd always kept Kevin and Brenda in my will as primary beneficiaries, splitting everything 70-30 with a small charity. My house in Oak Park, the one I'd literally helped build with my own hands back in 1983, was worth close to $600 now. Suddenly, their behavior over the past year made terrible sense. The suggestions that I was forgetting things when I wasn't. The times Brenda had asked about my will just to make sure everything was in order. The subtle comments about how big the house was for just one person, how I might be happier in a senior community. Kevin's newfound interest in my financial accounts, offering to help manage them. They'd been laying groundwork, softening me up, waiting for the right moment to push me aside and take control. The carbon monoxide story was probably their first real test. See if I'd meekly accept being displaced, if I'd question them, if I'd fight back. I hadn't fought. I just climbed into that shelter bed like a good, confused old man. That was my mistake. And theirs was thinking I'd stay that way. Frank called back around 8 p.m. Everything was arranged. Tomorrow morning, Channel 7 would run a human interest story. Retired engineer wins $10 million lottery. Hours after being abandoned at shelter on Christmas Eve. They'd interview me at a nice location. Frank suggested the Peninsula Hotel, downtown. Really twist the knife. But there was more to the plan, something Frank explained carefully. The lottery commission would be notified I was claiming my prize, but the actual payout wouldn't process for at least 5 business days. That gave us a window. Kevin and Brenda would see the news, panic, and show their true colors before they could regroup and hire their own lawyers. I asked Frank what he thought they'd do. He said people in financial trouble always make the same moves. Love bomb the victim, isolate them from outside help, then strike with legal documents while emotions are running high. We'd be ready. That night I barely slept. Not from excitement about the money, from rage, pure cold rage that my own son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, whose college I'd paid for, whose wedding I'd funded, could look at me and see nothing but an obstacle to money, an inconvenience, something to be warehoused and forgotten. I thought about my late wife, Patricia. She'd died 6 years ago, and I genuinely believed Kevin's increased attention afterward was grief and love. Now I understood. He was just making sure no one else got close to me, no one who might warn me, no one who might protect me. The architecture of their betrayal was elegant. I'll give them that. But they had made one critical error. They underestimated the foundation they were building on, me. In the morning, I'd let them see the cracks forming, and I'd watch as their whole plan collapsed. The Peninsula Hotel suite cost more per night than Kevin had given me for Christmas, which was nothing now that I thought about it. Frank had arranged everything, insisting I claim my prize in style. The reporter from Channel 7, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen, met me in the lobby at 7 a.m. She'd already done her homework. Somehow she'd gotten details about the shelter, about my background as an engineer, even about my wife's death. When she asked how I felt about my son abandoning me, I kept my voice level and said simply that I hoped there had been some misunderstanding. That soundbite, Frank later told me, was perfect. It made me look dignified and gave Kevin no ammunition to claim I was attacking him. The interview aired during the 8 o'clock news. By 8:30, my phone started buzzing like a hornet's nest. Kevin, Brenda, Kevin again. A number I didn't recognize that I later learned was their lawyer. Kevin 5 more times. I let it ring. Frank and I had breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Real eggs, Benedict, fresh coffee, the kind of meal that reminds you what money can actually buy. Around 9, I finally answered Kevin's next call. The desperation in his voice was immediate. He claimed there had been a terrible mix-up with the furnace repair company, that they had given him bad information, that he and Brenda had been devastated when they couldn't find me at the shelter. He'd been calling hospitals all night, he said. He'd been worried sick. None of it was true. Jerry had already sent me photos from last night. My house lit up until 2 a.m., cars still in the driveway, someone throwing up in my rose bushes. I told Kevin I was staying at a hotel for a few days, just to clear my head. I'd come by the house soon to talk. The relief in his response was almost funny. He said that was wonderful, that they'd have dinner ready, that we needed to celebrate as a family. Brenda got on the phone too, her voice syrupy with fake concern, saying how much they loved me and how they'd never forgive themselves for the confusion. I hung up and looked at Frank. He was grinning. The next call came an hour later. This time, Kevin's tone had shifted slightly. More businesslike. He wanted to know if I'd talked to any lawyers yet about the lottery money, because he'd heard horror stories about winners getting taken advantage of by predatory financial advisors. He had a guy he trusted, someone who could help me set up the right trusts and protections. I told him I appreciated the concern but hadn't made any decisions yet. Another shift in his voice, subtle, but I caught it after 40 years of listening to contractors try to cut corners on my projects. He suggested I come home that evening instead of waiting. Just family, no pressure. But maybe we could talk about some options, make sure I was protected. Protected. That word hung in the air like a threat. I agreed to come by around 6. After I hung up, Frank laid out the rest of the plan. I'd go to the house, let them wine and dine me, see what they pulled. He'd have his investigator, a former cop named Martinez, parked down the street with recording equipment. Illinois is a two-party consent state for recordings, so we couldn't use anything Martinez captured in court, but we could use it to anticipate their moves. More importantly, Frank had already contacted the Illinois Lottery Commission's Fraud Division and filed a preemptive alert. If anyone tried to claim they had power of attorney over my prize or attempted to coerce me into signing anything, red flags would go up immediately. But there was something else Frank wanted me to do, something that made my stomach turn. He wanted me to act confused, forgetful, vulnerable. He explained that Kevin and Brenda's best legal strategy would be to claim I was mentally incompetent, that I needed a guardian, that they were acting in my best interests. If we let them believe that story, let them commit to it publicly and legally, they'd back themselves into a corner. Once we proved I was fully competent, everything they'd done would look like exploitation rather than care. The trap was elegant. I'd spent my career building structures that could withstand pressure. Now I'd build a legal structure that would collapse on top of my son the moment he applied force to it. That afternoon, I practiced in front of the hotel mirror. I let my hands shake a little. I repeated myself. I squinted at my phone like the screen confused me. Patricia would have hated seeing me act this way, but Patricia also would have torn Kevin apart if she'd known what he was doing. At 5:30, Frank's driver took me back to Oak Park. My house looked exactly as I'd left it, except the lawn needed mowing and someone had damaged the mailbox, probably backing out drunk from last night's party. Kevin opened the door before I could knock. His smile was wide, but his eyes kept darting to the street, checking if I'd brought anyone. Brenda appeared behind him, wearing an apron and enough perfume to cover the smell of whatever she'd burned trying to cook. They welcomed me home like nothing had happened, and I walked into my own house knowing that, before this ended, I'd be the one holding the deed while they held nothing at all. Brenda had attempted pot roast. The meat was dry enough to sole a boot, but I chewed slowly and nodded along as Kevin talked about how worried they'd been. He'd changed clothes since this morning, pressed slacks, a cashmere sweater I'd bought him 2 birthdays ago, costume jewelry for a performance. I played my part, too. Forgot Brenda's sister's name mid-sentence. Asked what day it was twice. Let my hand shake just enough when reaching for the wine glass that Kevin had to steady it for me. His eyes lit up at that little tremor. I saw it. The same look a hawk gets when it spots a mouse in the open. After dinner, Kevin suggested we talk in the living room. My living room. The one where Patricia and I had watched our son grow up, where we'd hosted birthdays and Thanksgivings and quiet evenings reading the paper. Now it felt like enemy territory. Kevin pulled out an iPad and showed me articles about lottery winners who'd been scammed, bankrupt, within 5 years. He had statistics ready, horror stories queued up. Then he transitioned smoothly into his solution, a revocable living trust with him and Brenda as co-trustees. Just temporary, he insisted, just until I got oriented with my new financial situation. Brenda jumped in with her piece, talking about how overwhelming it must be at my age, how she'd read that sudden wealth could cause cognitive stress in seniors, how they just wanted to protect me from making any mistakes. Protect, that word again. I let them talk, nodded along, asked a few confused-sounding questions that Kevin answered with the kind of patience you'd use on a child. Then I said I needed to think about it, that it was a lot to process. Kevin's jaw tightened slightly, but he recovered. He suggested I sleep on it. Stay in my own bed tonight, and we'd discuss it more in the morning. Fresh perspective and all that. I agreed and excused myself upstairs, claiming exhaustion. My bedroom had been searched. Subtle. But I noticed drawers not quite closed all the way, papers on my desk restacked in the wrong order. My lockbox moved 3 inches from where I always kept it. They'd been looking for the lottery ticket, or maybe for my will, or both. What they didn't know was that Frank had the ticket secured in his office safe, and I'd already changed my will that afternoon. Everything now went to a charitable trust for homeless veterans, with a small provision for my grandson Jason if he completed military service or college, whichever he chose, without financial help from his parents. Kevin and Brenda got nothing. I heard them talking downstairs, voices low but urgent. I cracked my door and caught fragments. Brenda was pushing to act faster, worried I might talk to someone else. Kevin was insisting they had to be careful, maintain the appearance of concern. Then Brenda said something that made my blood ice over. She mentioned a facility, Oak Grove Senior Living. She'd already toured it, already talked to their memory care director. They could have me placed there within 72 hours if I signed the right papers. And once I was in, Kevin would have full medical power of attorney. Kevin told her to keep her voice down. I closed my door silently and sat on my bed in the dark. They weren't just after my lottery money. They'd been planning to warehouse me even before I won. The money just accelerated their timeline. My phone buzzed quietly. Text from Frank. Martinez got it all. House is wired. Everything they say from here on is recorded for our protection. Don't react, I typed back. They're talking about putting me in memory care. 3 dots appeared, then, perfect. Let them try. The evaluating physician is already on alert. Sleep didn't come easy that night, but it wasn't from fear. I'd spent my career calculating failure points. I knew exactly where this structure would collapse. Kevin and Brenda were loading weight onto beams that couldn't hold it, and they were too greedy to notice the cracks forming under their feet. Morning came cold and bright. I shuffled downstairs in my robe, playing up the confused old man routine. Kevin had coffee ready and a stack of papers on the dining table. The trust documents, professionally printed, already notarized in the spots where Kevin and Brenda had signed. Just needed my signature in 3 places. Kevin walked me through it with that same patient tone, explaining how this would protect my assets, ensure I didn't get taken advantage of, give me peace of mind. Brenda watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, smile fixed. I picked up the pen with shaking fingers and pretended to read. The document was exactly what Frank had predicted, complete financial control to Kevin and Brenda, with clauses that would make it nearly impossible for me to revoke without their consent. There was even language about cognitive evaluation. If they claimed I was incompetent, this document would support that claim. I looked up at Kevin. My son, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball, to change a tire, to shake hands firmly and look people in the eye. Now he was watching me like a poker player watching someone about to fold. I signed it, Walter Sterling. Not my full legal name, missing the middle name that Frank had already flagged with my bank as the only valid signature for major transactions. Kevin didn't notice. He just smiled, patted my shoulder, and told me I'd made the right choice. Brenda immediately took the papers and photographed them with her phone, probably sending copies to their lawyer. I excused myself to the bathroom and texted Frank. Done. They have invalid papers. His response, bank is ready. Let them try. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to step into it. Kevin drove me to the bank that afternoon, First National on Lake Street, where I'd held accounts for 35 years. He'd made an appointment with a personal banker, someone he claimed was experienced with complex situations like mine. The banker, a young man named Trevor with too much hair gel, greeted us like we were celebrities. He'd obviously seen the news. Kevin did most of the talking, explaining that we needed to set up new accounts to manage my lottery winnings, that I'd granted him power of attorney, and that we wanted to ensure everything was properly structured. Trevor asked to see the power of attorney documents. Kevin produced them with a flourish, sliding the papers across the desk. I sat there quietly, playing my role, occasionally nodding like I understood what was happening, but not quite following all the details. Trevor reviewed the documents, typed some information into his computer, then excused himself. He needed to make copies for the bank's records, he said. Standard procedure. He was gone for nearly 10 minutes. When he returned, his expression had changed. More formal. He asked if he could speak with me privately for just a moment. Bank policy for any client setting up large accounts, he explained. Kevin started to object, but Trevor was firm. Just a few minutes. Kevin and Brenda waited outside the office. Through the glass, I could see Brenda pacing, checking her phone repeatedly. Trevor closed the door, and his whole demeanor shifted. He told me the bank had been alerted to watch for potential financial exploitation attempts related to my account. He'd verified my signature against their records, and the power of attorney documents didn't match. Was I signing them under duress? I dropped the confused act and told him exactly what was happening. He listened, took notes, and explained that he'd document this conversation. If Kevin tried to make any large transactions, the bank would freeze them pending a formal investigation. When I returned to the waiting area, Kevin immediately asked what took so long. I told him Trevor had just been explaining some technical banking terms, making sure I understood the difference between checking and savings accounts. Kevin relaxed, probably thinking the bank was double-checking that I was too senile to manage money myself. We left with nothing accomplished, though Kevin seemed to think it had gone well. He kept talking about next steps, how we'd set up the accounts tomorrow, how he'd already been thinking about investment strategies. That evening, back at the house, I overheard another conversation. This time, they weren't even trying to keep quiet. Kevin was on the phone with someone named Rocco, discussing my house. The words quick sale and cash deal came through clearly. Kevin was laughing, saying the old man didn't even understand what he'd signed, that they'd have full control within a week. Then Brenda's voice. She'd found a buyer for my car, too. Some collector who wanted my '68 Mustang, the one I'd restored with Patricia back when we were newlyweds. Brenda was offering it for $40, half what it was worth, just to move it fast. I stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing, calculating. They weren't just stealing my lottery winnings. They were liquidating everything, my house, my car, my entire life's work. And they were doing it with the casual cruelty of people who'd convinced themselves they deserved it. My phone buzzed. Frank. Judge Mitchell approved the emergency conservatorship hearing, Friday at 10 a.m. We'll flip the script. I texted back, they're trying to sell everything. Frank, let them try. Every attempt is evidence. The next morning, Kevin presented me with more papers. These ones were simpler. A quitclaim deed for the house, transferring ownership to him for estate planning purposes, and a bill of sale for the Mustang. He explained that we needed to protect these assets from potential lawsuits. Apparently, lottery winners get sued all the time, he claimed. I hesitated, which was real this time. Signing away my house, even knowing the signature was invalid, felt like betrayal of something sacred. This house had Patricia's fingerprints on every wall, her choices in every room. But I signed, Walter Sterling. Wrong again. Kevin was ecstatic. He immediately called Rocco, confirmed the house sale, $50,000 cash, closing in 3 days. Then he called the car collector, set up delivery for Friday morning. They were moving fast now, probably sensing they needed to convert everything to cash before anyone could stop them. They'd already started packing up Patricia's jewelry, my tools from the garage, even the antique clock from the mantel that had belonged to my grandfather. What they didn't know was that every phone call was being recorded. Every document they'd signed or pressured me to sign was being photographed and cataloged by Martinez. Every transaction they attempted was leaving a trail that led directly to fraud charges. Thursday afternoon, Kevin sat me down and suggested we talk about my living situation. The house was sold, he explained, and the new owners wanted to move in by the end of the month. He'd found a wonderful facility, Oak Grove, where I'd have my own room, professional care, activities with other seniors. He made it sound like a resort. Brenda added that I really needed professional help now, that my confusion was getting worse, that they were worried about me hurting myself. She'd already scheduled an evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist for tomorrow afternoon. The psychiatrist, who was already expecting them, already briefed by Frank, already prepared to testify that I was fully competent and that this was textbook elder abuse. I told them I trusted their judgment, that if they thought it was best, I'd go along with it. Kevin actually hugged me, told me I was being so brave, so reasonable, that everything was going to work out perfectly. He had no idea that perfectly meant something very different to me than it did to him. That night, I packed a small bag. Not the expensive luggage Kevin had bought me last year, probably with my own money, now that I thought about it, but my old duffel from my Navy days, change of clothes, Patricia's photo, my father's watch, the things that mattered. Frank had arranged for a car to pick me up at 6 a.m. before Kevin and Brenda woke. I'd be staying at his place until the hearing. Safe. Protected. The real kind of protection, not the kind my son was offering. As I lay in bed that last night in my house, I thought about all the things I'd built in my life. Buildings that would outlast me. A marriage that had been solid for 43 years. A son I'd raised to be honest and strong. 1 out of 3 wasn't bad, I guess. In the morning, I left the house keys on the kitchen table and walked out the door. Kevin and Brenda's car was parked in the driveway, a Mercedes they'd bought 6 months ago, probably already counting on me being gone soon. The driver Frank sent was a woman named Rosa, former military, who'd worked security for the courthouse. She didn't ask questions, just helped me into the car and drove. I never looked back. Frank's house was a modest split level in Naperville, nothing fancy, but it felt safer than my own home had in weeks. His wife Angela made coffee and scrambled eggs without asking questions. Former public defender, Frank had told me once. She'd seen enough family ugliness to know when to just let someone breathe. Friday morning arrived cold and bright. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Daly Center. Frank went over everything one final time, while I dressed in my best suit, the charcoal one Patricia had helped me pick out for our 40th anniversary. The plan was surgical. We'd present evidence that I was fully competent, that Kevin and Brenda had forged power of attorney documents, and that they'd attempted to liquidate my assets under false pretenses. Then we'd flip the conservatorship petition. Instead of them taking control of me, we'd ask the court to freeze all transactions they'd initiated and file criminal complaints for fraud and elder abuse. At 9:30, we arrived at the courthouse. Kevin and Brenda were already there, along with a lawyer I didn't recognize. Young guy, expensive suit, probably convinced he was representing concerned family members. Kevin's face went white when he saw me walk in with Frank. He'd expected me to arrive confused, maybe with a social worker, certainly not with one of the best litigators in Cook County. Their lawyer tried to approach Frank, suggesting we mediate this before involving the court. Frank shut him down with 6 words. "See you in front of Judge Mitchell." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Judge Sarah Mitchell presided, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for despising family exploitation. Frank had chosen this venue carefully. Kevin's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a confused elderly man who'd won a fortune and was vulnerable to exploitation. He presented the power of attorney documents, claimed I'd been exhibiting signs of dementia, and suggested that my son was simply trying to protect me from predatory financial advisors. Then Frank stood up. He submitted my bank's report showing the signature discrepancy. He presented testimony from Trevor the banker, confirming I'd explicitly stated the documents were signed under pressure. He played audio recordings from Martinez's surveillance, Kevin and Brenda discussing how to liquidate my assets quickly, mentioning the confusion I was exhibiting that they'd been encouraging. Judge Mitchell's expression hardened with each piece of evidence. Then Frank called me to testify. I walked to the stand, and for the first time in a week I stopped acting. I explained my engineering background, my 40 years calculating stress loads and failure points. I recited the structural formulas for load-bearing capacity that I'd memorized in 1975. I discussed Patricia's death, my grief, my careful financial planning for retirement. Then I described Christmas Eve, the shelter, the lottery ticket, the way my son had looked at me when he thought I was too confused to understand what he was doing. Kevin's lawyer tried to interrupt, claiming I was being coached. Judge Mitchell told him to sit down. I continued. I explained how I'd deliberately played confused, how I'd intentionally signed documents with an incomplete signature, how I'd let them believe their plan was working while building a case against them. Judge Mitchell asked me directly, "Mr. Sterling, are you now, or have you ever been mentally incompetent?" I looked at Kevin while I answered, "No, Your Honor. I've been disappointed, betrayed, and heartbroken, but never incompetent." Frank then submitted evidence of the attempted house sale to Rocco, who turned out to have a criminal record for real estate fraud. Evidence of the car sale scheduled for that morning. Evidence of the facility where Kevin and Brenda had planned to place me, which had been investigated twice for Medicare fraud. The judge called a 15-minute recess. When we returned, her ruling was swift. The power of attorney documents were declared invalid. All transactions Kevin and Brenda had initiated were voided. My house remained mine. My car remained mine. My lottery winnings remained mine. Then she went further. She ordered a criminal investigation into attempted fraud, financial exploitation of a senior, and conspiracy. She issued a restraining order preventing Kevin and Brenda from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property, and she referred the case to the Illinois Attorney General's office for potential prosecution. Kevin started shouting. His lawyer tried to calm him down, but Kevin just kept yelling about how ungrateful I was, how he'd taken care of me after Patricia died, how I owed him. Judge Mitchell had the bailiffs remove him from the courtroom. Brenda just cried quietly, her mascara running. But I noticed she was crying into her phone, probably already texting someone, already planning her next move. Outside the courthouse, Frank fielded calls from 3 different news outlets. The story was already spreading. Lottery winner foils son's attempted fraud. Channel 7 wanted an interview, so did the Tribune. I told Frank no interviews. Not yet. This wasn't about publicity. It was about something else. That afternoon I drove to St. Jude's Shelter, the same place Kevin had dumped me Christmas Eve. I found the director, a tired-looking woman named Marie, and handed her a check for $100, $600. She stared at it like it might disappear. I told her it was for renovations, for beds, for whatever they needed. Patricia and I had always believed in taking care of people who'd fallen on hard times. Now I had the means to actually do something about it. Marie cried, said they'd name a wing after me. I told her to name it after Patricia instead. That evening, I returned to my house in Oak Park. Jerry came over with his wife, helped me change the locks. We found evidence that Kevin and Brenda had been there that morning, probably trying to grab anything valuable before the court order came through. They'd missed Patricia's jewelry. I'd moved it to a safe deposit box a week ago. I sat in my living room that night, in the chair where Patricia used to read, and thought about what comes next. The criminal case would take months, maybe years. Kevin and Brenda would probably hire better lawyers, try to claim they were misguided but not malicious. But I had something they didn't, time and resources. And I had something else too, my grandson, Jason. 17 years old, good kid, just poisoned by his parents' greed. Frank had already reached out to him through official channels, offered him a choice: stay with his parents and face whatever consequences came from their actions, or separate himself, finish high school, and accept help from his grandfather. Jason called me that night, asked if the offer was real. I told him it was. But there were conditions. No contact with his parents until after the trial. No access to easy money. If he wanted my help, he'd earn it through education or service. He asked if I hated him for what his parents did. I told him the truth. I was disappointed in his choices, but I remembered being 17 and stupid. Patricia would have wanted me to give him a chance. He cried, said he was sorry, said he didn't know how bad it had gotten. I believed him. Mostly. The trap had worked perfectly. Kevin and Brenda had walked into it thinking they were clever, thinking they'd found an easy mark in their aging, grief-stricken father. But they'd forgotten something fundamental. I'd spent my life building things that had to withstand pressure. And when pressure breaks something, you don't try to repair it. You tear it down and start over. The Illinois Attorney General's office moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, formal charges were filed: wire fraud, attempted theft, financial exploitation of a senior, conspiracy to commit fraud, and forgery. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Diana Torres, had made her career putting away white-collar criminals who preyed on the elderly. She called me to her office downtown, a cramped space filled with case files and cold coffee. She laid out their strategy. Kevin and Brenda would likely claim they'd acted in good faith, believing I was actually incompetent. Their lawyer would paint them as concerned family members who made mistakes in judgment, not criminals. Torres needed me to stay sharp, stay consistent. Any sign that I actually was confused or forgetful during the trial, and their defense became credible. I told her I'd spent 40 years having my structural calculations questioned by contractors trying to cut corners. I knew how to defend my work. She smiled at that. But there was something else she needed, evidence of motive. Why had Kevin and Brenda suddenly decided to move against me? The lottery win explained the timing, but not the groundwork. Torres wanted to know when this really started. I spent the next week going through my financial records with Frank's forensic accountant, a woman named Jennifer, who found patterns in numbers the way I found stress points in blueprints. What she discovered made my hands shake. And this time, it wasn't an act. Kevin had been embezzling from me for 3 years. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there. He had access to my accounts as a co-signer, supposedly to help with bills, after Patricia died. But Jennifer found 37 unauthorized withdrawals totaling over $85,000. He'd been careful, spacing them out, keeping them just under the threshold that would trigger bank alerts. Then, 6 months ago, the withdrawals stopped, not because Kevin had developed a conscience, because he'd drained everything he could without being obvious. My pension was direct deposited and spent on basic expenses. My savings were depleted. The only real asset left was the house. That's when the confused old man narrative started. That's when Brenda began touring memory care facilities. That's when Kevin started asking about my will. They'd been planning this long before I won anything. The lottery just gave them a bigger prize to chase. Jennifer compiled everything into a report that looked like a doctoral thesis. Torres added it to the case file. Kevin's lawyer tried to get it suppressed, claiming it was prejudicial. Judge Mitchell denied the motion. Meanwhile, Kevin and Brenda were falling apart in different ways. Kevin tried to maintain his innocence, giving interviews to local news claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that I was being manipulated by Frank Miller, that he was the real victim here. Brenda took a different approach. She filed for divorce from Kevin 2 weeks after the charges came down. Her new lawyer started making noises about how she'd been coerced by her husband, how she'd been afraid to speak up, how she was actually trying to protect me the whole time. Torres just laughed when she heard that, said it was the oldest strategy in the book, Rats, abandoning ship. Jason moved into a small apartment near his high school, paid for through a trust I'd set up with Frank's help. He came to visit me twice, awkward conversations over coffee where he tried to explain he hadn't known how bad things were. I didn't push him. Either he'd figure out how to be a decent human, or he wouldn't. That was his choice now. But there was something else happening that I hadn't expected: the community response. People I'd worked with decades ago started reaching out. Former clients, engineers I'd mentored, contractors I'd supervised on job sites. They'd seen the news. They wanted to help. Some offered testimony about my mental acuity. Others offered moral support. A group of veterans I'd worked with at the VFW started showing up to court hearings, filling the gallery, just being present. Kevin's lawyer complained that it was intimidation. Judge Mitchell said it was public interest. The preliminary hearing came in early February. Kevin and Brenda both pled not guilty. Their lawyers argued for separate trials. Brenda's attorney was already painting her as a victim of Kevin's schemes. Torres objected, said separating them would require the state to prove the same case twice. Judge Mitchell sided with the prosecution. Joint trial scheduled for April. That gave us 2 months to prepare. Frank suggested I leave town for a while, get away from the media circus, but I refused. This was my home. Patricia was buried here. I wasn't running. Instead, I started rebuilding what Kevin had tried to destroy. I hired Jerry's nephew to repaint the house, fix the mailbox, restore the lawn. I took the Mustang to a detailer, got it looking the way it had when Patricia and I used to drive it on summer evenings. I claimed my lottery winnings through Frank's office, officially this time. After taxes, it came to just under $6 million, a fortune by any measure. But it felt hollow somehow. Money couldn't repair what Kevin had broken. I sat down one night and made a list of what I actually wanted. First, see Kevin and Brenda face actual consequences, not just a slap on the wrist, not just probation, real time. Second, make sure Jason had a chance to choose better than his parents did. Third, do something meaningful with the money Patricia and I had never had, something she'd approve of. Fourth, figure out what the rest of my life looked like without the family I'd thought I had. The first three were straightforward. The fourth kept me awake at night. Torres called in mid-March with an update. Kevin's lawyer had approached her about a plea deal. Kevin would plead guilty to fraud and financial exploitation, accept 5 years in prison with possibility of parole after 3. In exchange, he'd testify against Brenda, claiming she'd been the mastermind. Torres wanted my input. I thought about it for a day. 5 years wasn't enough for what Kevin had done, but it was something. And watching him betray Brenda the same way he'd betrayed me had a certain poetic justice. I told Torres to take the deal. Brenda's lawyer immediately filed for a separate trial, claiming prejudicial testimony. Judge Mitchell denied it, said Brenda had plenty of time to cooperate if she'd wanted to. The trial date was set, April 15th, 3 weeks before my 69th birthday, 3 days after what would have been my 47th anniversary with Patricia. Timing, as Patricia used to say, is everything. I spent those final weeks preparing. Not for testimony. Frank and Torres had me rehearsed down to the minute. But preparing mentally for what came after. For seeing Kevin in an orange jumpsuit, knowing I'd put him there. For facing Brenda's inevitable accusations that I'd destroyed her life. For standing in front of whatever cameras showed up and explaining that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes people show you who they really are, and you have to believe them. The night before the trial, I drove to Patricia's grave, small cemetery in Forest Park, quiet, well-maintained. I told her everything, about Kevin, about the money, about the choices I'd made. I told her I hoped she understood, that I wasn't doing this out of spite, but out of something else. Maybe justice. Maybe just the need to prove that 68 years of living meant I could still stand up straight when people tried to push me down. She didn't answer, obviously. But the wind picked up, rustling through the oak tree we'd planted when Kevin was born. I took that as approval. In the morning, I put on my best suit, the one Patricia had picked, and drove to the courthouse. Frank met me outside. Inside. Torres was already setting up her files. In the gallery, the veterans from the VFW sat in the front row, silent support. Kevin was brought in wearing county jail scrubs. He didn't look at me. Brenda sat at the defense table in a conservative dress, makeup carefully applied to make her look vulnerable. Judge Mitchell took her seat, asked if both sides were ready. Torres stood up and said yes. Brenda's lawyer stood up and said yes. And just like that, the trial began. The trial where I'd finally settle accounts with the son I'd raised and the woman he'd married. Where I'd prove that being old doesn't mean being weak. Where I'd show them the difference between foundation and facade. The trial lasted 6 days. Torres built her case like I used to build structures. Foundation first, each piece supporting the next. Everything engineered to bear weight. Day 1 was financial evidence. Jennifer walked the jury through every forged document, every invalid signature, every unauthorized transaction. She showed Kevin's 3-year embezzlement pattern with charts and graphs. The jury took notes. Kevin stared at the table. Day 2 was testimony from Trevor, the banker, from Martinez, the investigator, from the staff at Oak Grove, who confirmed Brenda had toured their facility and discussed admission procedures for patients with cognitive decline. And Kevin's lawyer tried to discredit them. Torres had emails, phone records, and signed documentation for every claim. Day 3 was the recordings. The jury heard Kevin and Brenda discussing how to liquidate my assets, how to move fast before anyone noticed, how the old man wouldn't understand what was happening anyway. I watched the jurors' faces change as they listened. Sympathy turned to disgust. Day 4, Kevin testified as part of his plea deal. His lawyer had coached him well. He looked remorseful, claimed Brenda had manipulated him, said he'd been trying to protect me in his misguided way. But under cross-examination from Brenda's attorney, the story fell apart. Kevin admitted he'd initiated contact with Rocco about selling the house, admitted he'd forged the first power of attorney document before Brenda ever saw it. The jury saw right through him. Day 5 was Brenda's turn. She cried on the stand, claimed she'd been afraid of Kevin, said she'd only gone along with his plans because she thought I really was declining. Torres demolished her in 20 minutes, showed phone records of Brenda calling memory care facilities weeks before Kevin started forging documents, showed emails where Brenda calculated how much my estate was worth, including the lottery winnings she couldn't have known about yet. Brenda's lawyer tried to redirect, but the damage was done. Her story didn't hold water. Day 6 was my testimony. I took the stand wearing the suit Patricia chose, my father's watch on my wrist. Torres walked me through my background, Navy service, engineering degree, 40 years of building Chicago's skyline. Then she asked me to explain Christmas Eve. I told the story exactly as it happened. The fake carbon monoxide leak, the shelter, the lottery ticket, the cold calculation I'd made sitting on that cot, surrounded by men who'd lost everything, realizing my own son had tried to dispose of me like I was garbage. Torres asked how I'd felt. I looked at Kevin and answered honestly, like the foundation I'd built my life on had cracked straight through the middle. Not because of the betrayal you expect some people might betray you, but because I'd raised him. I'd taught him right from wrong. I'd shown him what it meant to be a man who keeps his word. And somehow, none of it took. Kevin's lawyer objected. Judge Mitchell overruled. Torres asked about the money, about my plans for it. I explained the donation to St. Jude's Shelter, the trust I'd established for Jason, contingent on him making something of himself without his parents' help. The scholarship fund I was creating at my old engineering school for first-generation students. Then Torres asked the critical question. Mr. Sterling, at any point during these events, were you confused, incompetent, or unable to understand what was happening to you? No, I said. I was clear-headed enough to know exactly what my son was doing, and clear-headed enough to stop him. Cross-examination from Kevin's lawyer was brief. He was bound by the plea deal and couldn't attack me too hard. Brenda's lawyer tried harder, suggesting I'd been vengeful, that I'd entrapped them, that I'd acted with malice rather than in self-defense. Torres objected before I could answer. Judge Mitchell sustained, but I answered anyway. The only malice in this courtroom came from the people who thought a 68-year-old man was too stupid to notice he was being robbed. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Brenda sobbed. Kevin just sat there, empty. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Kevin's plea deal gave him 5 years, but Judge Mitchell could have given Brenda up to 15. The prosecutor recommended 12. Before sentencing, Judge Mitchell asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. Frank had prepared one carefully worded to be emotional without being vindictive. I tore it up and spoke from memory instead. I told the court that Kevin had been a good kid once, that I'd failed him somewhere along the way, taught him the wrong lessons or failed to teach him the right ones, that I'd spend the rest of my life wondering where I went wrong as a father. But I also said that being a bad parent didn't excuse being a criminal, that Kevin had made his choices as an adult, and adults face consequences. I said Brenda had looked at a grieving widower and seen opportunity, that she'd calculated my worth down to the penny before I'd even finished mourning my wife. And I said that I wanted the court to show them the same mercy they'd shown me that Christmas Eve. None. Judge Mitchell sentenced Brenda to 10 years, eligible for parole after 6. As the bailiffs led them away, Kevin finally looked at me. I couldn't read his expression. Regret? Hatred? Maybe both. Brenda screamed that I'd destroyed her life, that I was a monster, that karma would catch up with me. Judge Mitchell had her removed from the courtroom, and just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Frank fielded questions while I stood in the background, letting him handle the circus. But one reporter, the woman from Channel 7 who'd done the first interview, pushed through and asked me directly, "Mr. Sterling, was this about the money or about justice?" I thought about that question, about what Patricia would say, about what kind of example I was setting for Jason, who was watching from somewhere. "Justice is just a fancy word for consequences," I said. "They thought they could do whatever they wanted because I was old and alone. Turns out being old means I've had time to learn a few things, and being alone means I don't have anything left to lose." That soundbite played on every news station in Chicago that night. Frank drove me home. Jerry and his wife had prepared dinner. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and potatoes. The kind of meal Patricia used to make. We ate in comfortable silence, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night in my own bed. The trial was over. Kevin and Brenda were headed to prison. My money was secure. My house was mine. But sitting there in the dark, I realized something. Winning felt a lot lonelier than I'd expected. Patricia's side of the bed was still empty. Kevin's childhood photos still hung in the hallway. The grandfather clock that had belonged to my father still ticked in the living room, measuring out the remaining years I had left. I'd protected everything I'd built, but I couldn't rebuild what had been destroyed. Some foundations, once cracked, don't repair. You can only demolish and start over. The question was, at 68, did I have enough time left to build something new? 6 months after the verdict, I stood in front of the newly renovated St. Jude's shelter for the dedication ceremony. Marie had insisted on calling the new wing the Patricia Sterling Memorial Wing. 60 new beds, modern bathrooms, a commercial kitchen that could serve hot meals 3 times a day instead of just dinner. The mayor showed up for photos. Channel 7 sent a crew. But what mattered to me were the men and women who'd actually used these facilities, people like I'd been that Christmas Eve, desperate and disposable in someone else's eyes. I gave a short speech about Patricia, about her belief that everyone deserves dignity regardless of circumstances. I didn't mention Kevin. He was irrelevant to this. Jason stood next to me during the ceremony. He'd finished his senior year, graduated with decent grades, and accepted admission to Illinois State for engineering. Not following in my footsteps exactly, he wanted to focus on renewable energy rather than structures, but close enough. He'd visited Kevin once in prison. came back quiet, wouldn't talk about it. I didn't push. Whatever he'd seen or heard, he needed to process it himself. Brenda had stopped accepting visits from anyone. Her lawyer had filed 3 appeals, all denied. She'd serve her full 10 years unless she found religion or developed a terminal illness, the only 2 things that moved parole boards in Illinois. The engineering scholarship fund I'd established at Northwestern had its first recipients, 8 students, all first generation, all hungry to learn. I'd met them at an orientation dinner, listened to their stories about growing up in neighborhoods where buildings fell apart and nobody fixed them. One kid, Marcus, reminded me of myself at 18, poor, angry, and determined to prove everyone wrong. I'd told him anger was fine as long as he directed it at problems instead of people. He'd nodded like he understood, but I knew it would take years for that lesson to sink in. It had taken me 40 years, and I'd still gotten it wrong with Kevin. Frank retired from law practice but started consulting on elder abuse cases pro bono. Turns out our case had inspired a wave of prosecutions across Illinois. Adult children who'd been quietly draining their parents' accounts suddenly found themselves under investigation. Frank said I'd started a movement. I said I'd just refused to be a victim. Tomato. The money, after all the donations and trusts and taxes, left me with about $3 million, more than enough for a comfortable retirement. I'd bought a small place in Naples, Florida, nothing fancy, just a condo near the beach where I could escape Chicago winters. But most of my time I still spent in Oak Park. The house had too many memories to abandon completely. I'd joined a woodworking club, started building furniture in the garage like my father had taught me. I'd reconnected with old Navy buddies, started attending VFW meetings regularly. I'd even started dating, though calling it that felt ridiculous at 69. Her name was Ellen, a widow I'd met at a grief support group. She'd lost her husband 2 years before Patricia died. We had dinner once a week, talked about our lives, shared the kind of honest conversation you can only have with someone who's already survived their worst day. She asked about Kevin once. I told her the truth. I didn't hate him, but I didn't forgive him either. I'd simply moved him into a different category in my mind, not son, just someone I used to know. Ellen understood. She had a daughter who'd stolen her wedding ring after her husband's funeral. Some betrayals you don't forgive, you just survive them. Jason came by the house every few weeks. We'd work on the Mustang together, replacing the carburetor, tuning the engine. He asked questions about Patricia, about what my marriage had been like, about how to know if someone really loved you. I told him love was easier to spot by its absence than its presence. You knew someone didn't love you when they calculated your worth like a balance sheet. Real love, the kind Patricia and I had, was the opposite. It looked for ways to give, not take. He asked if I'd ever loved Kevin. I said yes. But love wasn't infinite or unconditional, no matter what Hallmark cards claimed. Eventually, people could exhaust your love through persistent cruelty. Kevin had crossed that line. Jason asked if he'd crossed it too. I told him honestly he was standing right on the edge, but he could still step back. That's why I'd helped him. Because at 17, you still had time to choose who you'd become. The first year of Kevin's sentence, I received a letter from him. No return address on the envelope, just the prison postmark. I held it for a week before opening it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. He apologized, said he'd been wrong, said he'd let greed poison everything good in his life, said he understood if I never forgave him, but he wanted me to know he was sorry. I read it 3 times, looking for manipulation, for some angle he was working, but it sounded genuine, tired, broken. I wrote back, I'm glad you're sorry, but sorry doesn't repair what you destroyed. Maybe in a few years, when you get out, we can talk. Maybe. Until then, focus on becoming someone Patricia would have been proud to call her son. I didn't send it for a month. When I finally dropped it in the mailbox, I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not anger. Just the hollow ache of a closed chapter. People ask me if winning the lottery was worth it. if I'd trade the money to have my son back, to have my family intact. The answer is complicated. The money let me do good things. It gave Jason a chance. It housed 60 homeless people every night. It would send 8 kids to college, then 8 more next year, then 8 more after that. But more than that, the lottery forced Kevin and Brenda to show their true faces. If I hadn't won, they'd have kept embezzling, kept manipulating, kept pushing until they'd taken everything and left me dying alone in some state-funded facility where the staff couldn't remember your name. The money didn't corrupt them. It just revealed corruption that was already there. So no, I wouldn't trade it. I'd trade Kevin for a better son if I could, but the universe doesn't work that way. 2 years after the trial, I sat in my workshop in Oak Park, building a rocking chair for Jason's future kid. He'd started dating a girl from his sustainable energy class. The wood was cherry, the joints were hand-cut dovetails, the kind of craftsmanship that takes time and patience. The radio played old Sinatra. The smell of sawdust reminded me of working with my father. Patricia smiled at me from her photo on the workbench. Outside, snow fell on the city I'd helped build. Inside, I shaped wood into something useful, something that would last beyond me. At 70 years old, I'd outlived my wife, outlasted my son's betrayal, and outmaneuvered people who'd thought age made me weak. I'd learned that being old wasn't the problem. Being underestimated was the opportunity. The chair would take another month to finish. I wasn't in a hurry. I had time. And if I'd learned anything from this whole disaster, it was that time, properly used, was the most powerful tool in any engineer's kit. Patricia had always said I built things that lasted. Turned out that applied to my life, too. I just had to know when to reinforce and when to demolish. The rocking chair would last 100 years if Jason took care of it, taught it to his kids, his grandkids. A legacy built on craftsmanship instead of cruelty. That's the difference between what I built and what Kevin destroyed. One would stand the test of time. The other was already forgotten. I sanded the armrests smooth, feeling the grain beneath my fingers, and wondered where you were watching this from. Probably somewhere warmer than Chicago, I hope. Maybe you're dealing with your own family complications. Maybe you're wondering if standing up for yourself is worth the cost. All I can tell you is this: dignity isn't negotiable. Not at any age, not for any reason, not for any amount of money. And if anyone, family or otherwise, tries to take yours, make them regret it. Thanks for sticking with this story. If it meant something to you, leave a comment about where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because we're not done building yet.